Brian Jones and I have known each other for a long time now. We met at Texas A&M University, where he was my boss, actually. And we realized the day we met that we had a lot in common. That was in the 1980s. Intellectually in common. We had a lot of friends in common and interest in the same literature. But he was an expert on urban politics, and my background was in comparative politics. My first book had been about French politics, my dissertation, but it was about agenda setting. And Brian was interested in that issue as well. So we've written a number of books together, and we've started this project, which actually, this Policy Dynamics was the first book published from the Agendas Project in the United States. And then, much to our surprise, people from other countries came to us and said, how could we create this project in our country? And the first person was Christopher Green Peterson from Denmark. And he had visited the University of Washington, and he went back to Denmark and he just replicated the entire project in Denmark. And so that was the first time that we had a comparative project. But I want to give you a little piece of background. This is a graph that we did in our first book in 1993. And we realized that we could ask very, very simple questions. If you read a newspaper story about the chemical industry in the 1960s, in the United States, most likely it would have said something extremely positive, because in the 1960s we were convinced that we could use science to advance civilization. And people were extremely enthusiastic about the possibilities of science, and in particular in the area of pesticides. People thought that we would have what they called a green revolution. Through the advances of science, we would eliminate poverty, and we would reach a new area of agricultural abundance. And the United States, by coincidence, having the biggest pesticides companies and the biggest agricultural industries, would lead a world where there would be no more hunger. And the United States would export DDT and other pesticides across the world to eliminate hunger, produce abundance, and eliminate also malaria and other diseases. And that was the case. And if you look at, this is just a count of how much attention was there to the industry of pesticides. There was a huge surge of attention right after World War II. And all of that attention was positive. We saw this enthusiasm. And this was very simple coding of titles of magazine articles. And then in 1956, the bottom fell out. And we saw that there was still a lot of attention. The blue line is how much attention there was, but the red line shows that that attention became highly negative. It was about endangered species. It was about problems. It was all bad news. So we moved very quickly from enthusiasm to criticism, and it happened pretty much in 1 year, 1956. Okay? We replicated this analysis for a number of different public policies in our early book. Smoking, if you think about the history of the tobacco industry, it was glamorous, it was sexy, it was all about Hollywood. Doctors and nurses smoked oftentimes in the operating room. Okay? And today these things would be incomprehensible. Okay? Similarly, nuclear power in the United States was the subject of a reputation that was incredibly enthusiastic and positive. And then in the 1960s, in the late 1960s in our country, nuclear became pejorative. We saw it in a negative way. So we discovered, or we thought, that that type of punctuation or lurching, abrupt change in policies, we could study that systematically. So in our first book, we studied 9 particular issues that I can't say were really the object of any kind of random sampling. They weren't necessarily generalizable. There were 9 of them rather than just one, so we had more examples to go on. But we were faced with a question of whether this would be generalizable. So Brian and I organized a database that would allow us to assess these questions systematically across the entire political system. And that's where the Agendas project came from. An effort to simply create a database of everything the government does, so we could track how much attention the government is paying, or the relative amount of activity across all the areas of public policy, from healthcare to transportation to energy to defense to foreign policy to education, everything. And we've developed a theory that's really based on cognition. That is, the human brain, we know, can only think about 7 things at once. You can't have in your mind more than 5 to 9 things, but roughly 7. And if you look at the front page of the newspaper, and you count how many stories there are on the front page, usually it's 7. And if you think about how many digits you can remember, like somebody's phone number, and I know phone numbers have gotten long now, but it was 7 numbers. You can remember 7. You can't remember 42 numbers, but you can remember 7 things. Okay? And it doesn't really matter if the number is 3 or 5 or 7 or 10 or 20. The number is not 147,000. You can't simultaneously pay attention to thousands and thousands of things. Okay? Many of you might be thinking about picking up your child at school right now while you're listening to me, so you're paying attention to 2 things. Okay? But you can't pay attention to 1,000 things. Your brain is not capable of that. And that's the simple foundation of what we're studying. It's about how you allocate your attention. So you can analyze your own attention. We can think about it at the individual level. And what we do in the book, or in the project, is think about that for governments. Now, governments, or universities, institutes, collections, organizations, can have a division of labor. So they differ from a human individual in that they can have a division of labor. So you can simultaneously fight a war in Afghanistan, fight a war in Syria, deliver the mail, build new highways, have a healthcare debate in Congress. A government can simultaneously do many things, but a government leader cannot. The top levels of government are still subject to these problems of cognitive limitations. So our attention, the front pages of the newspaper still can only have 7 articles. And maybe it could have 12 articles, but it can't cover the entire range of activities of a government. Okay? So the agenda is subject to the same cognitive or attention limitations as an individual. Now, one of the things another key element of public policy is that there's experts and there's non-experts. Experts on pesticides always knew that there were good aspects of pesticides and there were dangers associated with the industry. And if you were to be in a conversation, or if you were to watch at a conference, people who are scientific experts on any particular problem, they know the full range of arguments for and against. But outsiders, they only know what the experts tell us. And they only know what's in the newspaper. So their understanding of the complexities of a detailed public policy area, such as smoking and tobacco, or transportation, or defense, or foreign policy, it's going to be very simplified when it gets translated from the community of experts into the community of non-experts. And as you know, prime ministers, politicians, journalists tend to not be experts. Okay? So the key translation, the point of interest, is when an issue emerges from its discussion within the technical community of scientific expertise into the political world. It has to, inevitably, that's going to involve some mistranslation. Something's going to be lost in translation. The political leaders are going to either respond with enthusiasm, and this is a fantastic opportunity. Self-driving cars. Every politician in the Western world is convinced that we have to promote the industry of self-driving cars because if we don't do it, the Chinese and Japanese will beat us. And then, so now we're going to have all kinds of changes to the laws in every country to allow cars to drive themselves. And probably it'll happen a little bit before the technology is really ready. Believe me, okay? That's just how it works. Okay? There'll be an enthusiasm and a competition and a mimicking and a cascade process will happen so that this new technology will be adopted with enthusiasm, just like pesticides. Nuclear power was adopted with enthusiasm until we realize that there's a problem. So now, typically, policies are very stable. We don't see a lot of changes in public policy, and I just want to go through some reasons why that might be. The best reason would be that the policy works very well. We're happy with the policy. You can imagine how often that happens. But still, there are a number of policies that really do work in every country. You know, people do typically get an education, or many people do. Or, I mean, I'm always surprised that there's how the traffic moves on roads. There's a red light, and everybody understands it. There's a green light, and everybody understands that you go when it's green and you stop when it's red. And that is a policy that really works. And if you notice, it's a worldwide policy. It's a policy that nobody ever debates. Nobody ever says we should have a different color system. You know, white and black, orange and pink. Nobody ever says that. That's a policy where we see incredible stability. And I think the reason is it works. We don't have people misunderstanding red means stop, green means go. That's a policy that is functional. But there's a lot of other reasons, and the main reason I think is that and this policy may be imperfect, but it's only causing 10,000 deaths a year, and there's another policy that's causing 100,000. There's another problem that's even worse. Okay? So the urgency of the problem is an important predictor of how much attention we may pay to it. And another is that there's no consensus on any alternative policy. So anyway, I just list a few ideas here about why we might have stability. And only the first one is really one that we could be happy about. The other ones are all about compromises. There could be many reasons for dramatic changes in policy. There could be a stochastic crisis such as a hurricane, an earthquake, or an economic crisis that comes from another country. But there's many other reasons for that other than stochastic shocks. And I just want to lay out this problem. The problem in any country is, what should the Prime Minister pay attention to? Now maybe you'd prefer the Prime Minister just go home and not pay attention to anything. But there's always a question. You're the Prime Minister of a complicated country, a big country with a complicated potential policy agenda. When you get up in the morning, what should you pay attention to? What problem is the most severe that you could potentially solve? And it turns out that that's not a very simple question, and that's a very generalizable question. Okay? So our research started out in the United States, and our first book in 1993 had many elements of theory building that European colleagues thought were peculiarly American. For example, we talked about venue shopping, how things could move from one political institution to another. But in the United States, with separation of powers and federalism, that made more sense in the American context. But as people have replicated some of the research in other countries, we find that things do move from the judiciary to the legislature to the executive. And also, we didn't pay a lot of attention to political parties. And I think partly in the United States, political parties are organizationally very weak. And that was a question that our European colleagues asked about the generalizability of our approach. But these questions, what does the Prime Minister decide to do? When the Queen of England gives a speech from the throne, how does the Prime Minister's office write that speech? How do they decide to focus how much on healthcare versus education versus defense or foreign policy? That's a generalizable question. So we developed a theory that says if you can only pay attention to about 7 things, and if you're a prime minister, you might really think that you really can only have about 3 major priorities. If you need to make 3 big reforms, let's say you come to office and you have a long list of policy priorities you would like to do. I remember when the socialists came into office when I was doing my dissertation in France, they had a platform of 110 propositions. They wanted to reform the whole country because, of course, it would have been terrible under the previous system. But I think it's fair to say that they implemented maybe half a dozen. So it really matters how you prioritize that comprehensive list, because the world does not work the way a computer works. We can't, our brains don't work that way. We can't comprehensively and simultaneously initiate so many reforms. So we have a threshold of urgency. And here's the thing that I think is really interesting. The threshold varies depending on stochastic events from other areas. And I'm going to give you one little example. I think I have this slide, but when the United States entered the war in Iraq, before, let me just, no, I didn't do it. Before the invasion by President W. Bush of Iraq, about 3% of the stories in the New York Times were about Afghanistan, Iraq, Al-Qaeda, or the war on terror. 3%. But as of the moment when we sent troops to Iraq, it was 40%. 40% of the stories in the New York Times consistently for the next 10 years. 10 years. 40% of all the stories on the front page of the New York Times, roughly speaking, focused on the war against terror, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the war in Syria, something about that. If you think about that as using up part of the available energy for policy reform, one of the best ways to do nothing in domestic politics is to get involved in a foreign war. Okay? Because that threshold of urgency, threshold of what's the most important issue, depends not only on how severe is your issue. Let's say you're spending your entire career trying to reform the healthcare system. If the United States goes to war in some other country, your chance of implementing that domestic policy reform just went down by a significant amount, and you didn't do anything wrong. It's got nothing to do with the quality of your proposal. It's got to do with space on the political agenda. So we pay attention to that. I just want to mention something about this most recent book, because I talked about the first book. We call this book The Politics of Information. It came out 2 years ago, again with Brian Jones, but we try to focus this book about the problem of information and how the problem in politics is not that there's a scarcity of information, the way an economist might think of information, that it's scarce and you have to pay money to get relevant information. Our problem in politics, we think, is that there's too much information. It's overwhelming. Okay? And information there's many forms of information. And here's, I'll just mention this one other element of this book. I think we have a misunderstanding of how politicians or political systems really make decisions. I think typically when we think about problem solving, we think, just the way you learn it in school, is what we would call an engineering problem. An engineering problem is anything that humans can understand. Okay? Anything that we can actually master. How to build a building, how to build a bridge, okay? How to design a school so that students can go to classrooms. You know how many students there's going to be, how many per classroom, how many teachers you'll need to hire. All of that is a problem that a computer spreadsheet can be used for to master the problem. Now those problems that we call engineering problems could be very complicated. As a matter of fact, I was on an airplane with somebody one time and I was going over my slides and he got interested, and he said that he worked for a pharmaceutical company and he designed new factories. And the factories for these pharmaceutical companies cost several $1 billion. Billion. Okay? It was a factory to manufacture drugs, and he would go around and design them. And I said, well, do you understand every input, every item that has to go into the factory? He says, oh yeah, we have a computer, a supercomputer, and we have 155,000 inventory items, and we know exactly at any given time how many of each item are on inventory. And we know exactly how many we need to build the factory. Okay, so that's a complicated problem, but it's an engineering problem because the computer can comprehensively assess everything needed to transform an input into a product. Okay, so a manufacturing item like building a car or a spaceship, it's a complicated problem, but it can be fully mastered. Now, a complex problem is improve the economy of Hungary. Okay, that's a complicated problem. It's not just complicated, it's complex. And by complex, I mean several things. People sometimes use the phrase a wicked problem. A wicked problem or a complex problem is one where you don't know what you're really trying to do. Okay, improve the economy. What does that even mean? Furthermore, you don't know how to do it. There's so many different ways you could possibly approach the problem that it's unclear exactly how you should approach it. And let's say I think, as a professor, I always think that our economies would be improved if more people went to college and had a higher education. Okay? Because I'm a professor and I think education is valuable, and it just so happens that I would benefit from that. But still, as a professor, I believe in the power of education. Okay? Somebody else might say, well, we need better transportation systems, and if the workers could get to the jobs, the economy would therefore improve. And it just so happens that they might own a manufacturing plant that builds buses or trains. Okay? So everybody would have their pet solution to the problem. Okay? This is a complex problem, and this is where we think most theories of public policy or decision making implicitly take on the engineering paradigm, dealing with the problem where we know what the problem, we can state the problem precisely and we know what the solution would be. That's like a manufacturing problem. Engineering problems demand expertise, but complex problems demand ambiguity, complexity. We use that to explain this paradox of search. That is, if you don't know what you're looking for, if the idea is improve the economy, or like in the United States Constitution, it says one of the purposes of government is to enhance the pursuit of happiness. Okay? The purpose of the United States government is to promote the pursuit of happiness. Okay? So we don't know what that means. Okay? So if that's what the government is supposed to do, and obviously it has other things, provide roads and infrastructure, school, hospital, then it means that the more participation, the greater the number of distinct proposals. Okay? And I'm going to just show you a couple highlights of this. I don't want to go through it. Let's say the idea is we're going to promote the pursuit of happiness, or we're going to promote greater economic growth. And there's 1,000 people interested in participating in that discussion. As you have more and more sources of information, everybody giving potentially useful ideas about how to promote economic growth, whoever has to prioritize and evaluate all those proposals is going to be overwhelmed. So the only way that we can solve that decision-making problem is to censor the information that comes in. And the more we censor the information, the easier it is to finally make a decision, because we're only evaluating a subset of all the possible bits of information. But that's inevitable. We have to do that, because we can't possibly make a decision if we have an uncensored, unfiltered series of bits of information coming in at us. So we enhance decision-making by eliminating elements of information. In the long run, information always wins. That information will continue to keep coming in. We just won't be paying attention to it. And we think that theoretically that's the source of punctuations in public policy. If you ignore information, it doesn't mean it's not going to still be affecting the world. It's going to be happening outside of your watch. You won't be paying attention to it, but it'll still be happening. And eventually there'll be a problem that's so big that it can't be ignored. Give you one little highlight of our research. From 1945 here till about the mid-1980s, the United States government incorporated more and more and more elements and topics into public policy. The U.S. Congress debated on a wider and wider variety of distinct topics. And then that process stopped just before Ronald Reagan became president. In the time of Jimmy Carter, the late 1970s, this increase in amount of a range of information, diversity of the public policy debate stopped. Right? People see that as a big distinction between the Great Society and the enthusiasm of the growth of government in the 1970s, or 1950s, 60s, until the 70s, and then the stop. We think that that is part of the more generic distinction between openness to new information and the paradox that the more information, the more difficult it is to make a decision. So a lot of the conservative backlash against the growth of government, we think, is actually could potentially be associated simply with a decision-making problem. Government is too complicated, it's too complex, it's overwhelming. So therefore there's a backlash. So we say, well, we won't pay attention to the poor. That's just off the agenda. We'll only focus on economic growth. We won't pay attention to distribution and the inequalities. But in our country right now, the inequalities continue to grow. And we can ignore them, but only for so long, because information will always win out over control. So I think we see the similar trends in every way we look at the data, the complexity of how congressional committees evaluate information grew and grew and grew, and then it leveled off. So there's this effort to control information. All this stopped in about the late 1970s. Yeah. So I think that's enough about our project. We have now, to do this, we had created these databases that we can talk about, but it involved a comprehensive assessment of everything that the government does. And to do that, we ended up with assigning them into categories. And it turns out the categories of government action, they're not the same in every country. And we expanded our project from the United States, especially when we got to England. They had to have categories for regulating the royal family. And we don't have a royal family in the United States, so that was a new topic that was completely absent in the United States, and it was an important element in British politics. And so there are some slight distinctions, like, for example, we don't have an official government religion in the United States, but many countries have government activities to appoint religious officials in their country. In Denmark, it turned out that 30% of all the government activity had to do with the fishing industry. And so they had very complex systems of regulating fishermen and how the fishing industry operates, because it's so important to their economy. In Spain, When we went to Spain, they had incredible complexities with dealing with the Basque situation and what they called internal terrorism, but was that similar to what we would call terrorism, or do we want to distinguish between domestic criminality that's associated with organized opposition to the state as compared to either international terrorism or just crime? And for the Spanish, it was important to have a distinction between organized political opposition to the state, which is often illegal and violent, and Al-Qaeda, and also just plain old crime. It's different. So there were a few adjustments that we had to make whenever we went into another country, but for the most part, we were able to use the exact same system of policy topics. And then in different countries, as we expanded, there's different particular actions. There's always media, there's always laws, there's always a budget. But in the United States, one of our key indicators of government activity is a congressional hearing. And in many other countries, there's no such thing, but there's usually parliamentary question time, so we can count how many questions there are about which topics. So far, we've done this now in about 20 countries, and I just want to give an idea that the Policy Agendas Project is a compromise. It doesn't do everything. Its goal is to be comprehensive, not to cherry pick or to isolate just environmental policy or morality, or it's comprehensive, everything the government does. But it's a very small bit of information about those activities. We know the date when it occurred, what type of activity it was, and whether it was about health care or transportation. That's pretty much all we know. But that little bit of information allows us to track the relative attention of all the governments in the West, and mostly in the Western world, to the different topics. So it facilitates, but it does not by itself allow studies of framing or partisanship. But others can use it to start. So far we have projects in probably 20 countries. There's projects developing in other countries, including some big ones, Brazil, China, and Japan. And the key is that air pollution is air pollution. Endangered species protection is defined in the same way in every country. Healthcare accessibility, cost overruns in the healthcare system, that's a code that you can analyze across any country. So it's the same definition of topics, and we hope that by continually expanding this, it'll be like honey for bees. That is, political scientists need data, and policy analysts need comparable information across a wide variety of countries, and we hope to simply provide that. And we have no idea of the theoretical reasons why people might want to use our data, and we don't care. People can use it for a wide variety of reasons, and that's what we want to develop, is that infrastructure that will allow a new literature and public policy. So I'll stop there. If there's questions, I'm glad to answer them.
Thank you very much.